President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, I'm pleased to be able to come to the floor today to support Ukraine. And I'm especially pleased that we have colleagues from both sides of the aisle who are here to support the Ukrainians in this unjust war against Russia. Now, I understand and appreciate the desire for peace in Ukraine. And I understand why we should end the senseless killing of innocent people. And I think if you ask Ukrainians, they want this war to end too. They're watching how this war is destroying their country. But the best way to make a deal here is to give Ukraine as much leverage as possible. I'm pleased to hear today that there is the potential for a ceasefire, that as part of that, U.S. intelligence sharing would be turned back on. I think we should also keep sanctions on Russia. I think NATO membership should be on the table for Ukraine because Vladimir Putin only understands strength. When he invaded Crimea in 2014, a lot of people, including myself, didn't think our response was strong enough. We were concerned that Vladimir Putin couldn't be trusted to abide by negotiated agreements. And 3 years ago, of course, Putin proved us right when he directed his forces to attack Ukraine again in a full-scale invasion. His missiles struck kindergartens and maternity wards, and they continue to strike innocent civilians. His soldiers carried out massacres in places like Bucha, where just a few weeks ago I saw firsthand, along with Senators Bennett and Tillis, the lingering effects and trauma of what Vladimir Putin and the Russians did in Bucha. We heard about the indiscriminate murdering of civilians, the rape and the torture of innocent bystanders. Well, Russian soldiers rushed into Ukraine from the north, from the south, and from the east, and many predicted that the country would fall within weeks, if not days. But as we stand on the floor today, Ukraine is still standing. And that's thanks in no small part to the strong bipartisan support that Ukraine has enjoyed here in Congress. And I think that support, that strong bipartisan support, has been there because we understand that this is a fight for democracy. This is a fight to stop the overturning of the international rules-based order, to stop a dictator like Vladimir Putin from going into a country and thinking just because he wants to take it over, he can. And we know that not only are our allies watching what happens here, but so are our adversaries. North Korea is already fighting on Russia's side against the Ukrainians. Iran is providing missiles. China is providing support. They are watching what America does here. We understand as Republican and Democratic senators that to have a lasting peace in Ukraine, we need to make sure that Russia is accountable and that we have security guarantees. Now, there are a number of ways to do that, and they don't necessarily mean U.S. troops on the ground or even NATO troops on the ground. Europe is working through different options. As I said, Senator Tillis and I were recently in Ukraine, along with Senator Bennett, and we saw firsthand that despite Russia's advantages in size and manpower, that Ukrainians are not giving up. Ukraine now has one of the most advanced militaries in the world, the most advanced in Europe. I came away impressed by their ingenuity, their ability to innovate in the face of Russian aggression. Ukrainians are sharing those lessons from the battlefield with our United States military. They're helping us prepare for the wars of the future. And it's not just something that we understand in Congress is important, but my constituents in New Hampshire understand how important it is that we support the Ukrainians. And I brought with me today a poster from a community effort in New Hampshire that has raised $4 million to support the people and children particularly of Ukraine. They've provided 3 million plus pounds of food, 10,000 sleeping bags, hundreds of generators. 900 children are in trauma counseling because of their effort. They've raised over $4 million from New Hampshire to support the Ukrainians. And Americans across this country understand why this fight is important to us. It's why we're here on the floor today to reiterate that we stand with Ukraine. And I urge all of my colleagues who support Ukraine, Republicans and Democrats alike, to join us. Join us in speaking up for Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. Join us in pushing to strengthen Ukraine's place at the negotiating table. Join us in calling on Moscow to withdraw from the Ukrainian territory that is seized. Thousands of Ukrainians have given their lives in this fight. They've been on the front lines for all of us. As a group of women in the Ukrainian military said to me in the first year of the war, give us the equipment, give us the arms so that we can fight the Russians, so that you and America don't have to. Well, they've been on the front lines for all of us, defending the international order that has served American interests since the end of World War II. I hope we will continue to support them in that effort. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield to my colleague, Senator Murkowski.
The senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I'm pleased to be here on the floor today with the senator from New Hampshire, as well as other colleagues on both sides of the aisle, to speak in support of Ukraine. We're now more than 3 years into Russia's unprovoked, brutal war against Ukraine. I think we are encouraged by the news that we are seeing advance this afternoon with the talks in Saudi Arabia between the United States and Ukrainian officials as they talk about the potential for a ceasefire, the potential for the U.S. to restore military support and intelligence sharing. These are promising developments. I think we all want to arrive at that place where we see peace. But when we talk about how the peace is gained, I think, again, the discussions that are had on this floor, those of us that have had an opportunity to go to Ukraine and see the situation on the ground ourselves, to speak with so many who are engaged in this effort, the stakes are not only about Ukraine's sovereignty. The stakes also include our values, our security, and our credibility as the leader of the free world. This is not just a regional conflict on the edge of Europe. It's a global test. It's a test of whether the international community will allow borders to be redrawn by force. A test of whether democracies will continue to stand together when authoritarian regimes literally try to rewrite the rules. And yes, it's a test. It's a test of American leadership in the 21st century. As was stated, the Ukrainian people are not asking us to fight their war. They are doing the fighting. It is their sons, it is their daughters that are dying. What they're asking of us as the world's leading democracy is to help us with the tools, help us with the arms, the ammunition, the logistical support, help them protect them, help them with the intelligence that can be provided through satellite imaging, help them so that they can protect themselves. And I think that we should be proud. We should be proud as Americans that we have helped to make a difference. We have helped Ukraine push back the Russian advance. It has prevented Kyiv from falling to Russia. It continues to help Ukrainian defenders hold the line there. So every weapon system, every round of ammunition and radar or drone that we have helped to provide, these aren't just supplies. These are literally lifelines to the people. And when we think about the people, I think it is important to also recognize another way that we have helped in this country. Senator Shaheen showed a picture of the Ukrainian families and the people in her state. In Alaska, we have welcomed, we have embraced, we have helped situate Ukrainian families who have sought refuge, who are here in a place like Alaska, in a place like New Hampshire, because where they call home is not safe to be. And so how we can support them is important, because when we support Ukraine, we're not just helping a nation in need, we're protecting and we're preserving the rules-based international order that has helped keep the peace for generations. And if we falter, others are watching. Others are watching the situation in Moscow, in Beijing, in Tehran, in Pyongyang. And so if it is seen that we are walking away from Ukraine, if we embrace appeasement, we embolden every aggressor around the globe. And more than that, it's our allies, it's our friends, our partners. They're watching us, and they're asking the question, is the United States a country that can be depended on? Are we seeing this alliance that we have had, that we have worked to nurture and build for 80 years, are we seeing that fray? I understand, absolutely, the calls for restraint in our support, that the war costs too much, we need to be focusing on issues here at home. But again, the fight is bigger. The fight is bigger than that. It is significant, yes, for Ukraine, but it is about democratic values and standing up for democratic values. It's about stopping the expansionist ambitions of authoritarian regimes. Because I think we've got to be honest here. Look at history. Russia is not going to stop at Ukraine. In 2005, in his State of the Nation address, Putin said, quote, "The demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century." And he's never hidden his ambitions from that statement. When Putin says the ongoing collapse of Western hegemony is irreversible, he means us. He means our allies and the broader narrative about the decline of Western influence. He wants NATO to be divided, and he wants the United States isolated. This works to his advantage. He just probably didn't expect that America was going to do it for him. Now, as an Alaskan, I get geography. I'm acutely aware of the threat a more aggressive Russia poses. Just across the Bering Sea, 2 miles separate the United States, Alaska's Little Diomede, and Russia's Big Diomede. We see Russia's military buildup when we see the Russian bombers that are flying in our ADIZ, when we see the Russian and the Chinese naval forces out in our waters. But we also know and have long known that a destabilized Europe means a more dangerous world for the United States. And this conflict may seem like a continent away, a long ways away, but the consequences are anything but distance. We all want this war to end, but it cannot end on Russia's terms. If it does, we should expect nothing more than a temporary respite before the resumption of hostilities. Why are we going to start trusting and believing Putin's word now, given his track record? We've seen this before. History doesn't lie, and the appeasement of tyrants does not bring peace. Russia started this conflict, and it's critical for us to stand with Ukraine to end it, not just because it's right, but because it's necessary. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The senator from Vermont.
Thank you. I thank my colleagues, Republican and Democrat, for coming here to the floor today in support of our continued support for Ukraine. I was heartened, Mr. President, to hear today that President Zelensky is on board with the U.S. ceasefire proposal. That's good news. And it does highlight that President Zelensky has shown time and again that he's always willing to negotiate for peace. Putin has always been the aggressor, and that is why I believe we must stand with Ukraine. You know, the question before us today whether we will continue to stand with Ukraine has immense implications for the security of the United States, of our European allies, and of world peace. These are critical questions to get right. Should the United States stand by our 80-year-old security commitments in Europe? Should the United States stand behind the rules-based order established in the aftermath of the catastrophic World War II? Or should we abandon those rules, despite the fact that they have served our national security interests for so long? Those are the questions. You know, in the aftermath, Mr. President, of the horrors of World War II, in which more than 80 million people died, the United States did establish alliances and security commitments in Europe and determined that this was the way to avoid a World War III. Investments in NATO, armed forces in Europe, and European democracy and economic prosperity. We did not want to repeat what happened after World War I, where none of this was done, and it created the conditions for a Second World War. Perhaps most importantly, America asserted that it would defend a Europe so borders are not changed by force, where nations cannot invade weaker neighbors with impunity. Was that effort worth it in these past 80 years? Since some are now suggesting otherwise, I'd like to mention a few of the reasons why the post-World War II order in Europe, led by the United States and enacted by a treaty in this United States Senate, was a success in keeping the peace. No conflict. Europe has avoided a major war for 80 years. The end of the USSR, Europe weathered the storm of the breakup of the Soviet Union, ushering in new countries committed to democratic values of freedom and democracy. Yugoslavia, Europe and NATO weathered the conflict and the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, demonstrating unprecedented EU-NATO cooperation and commitments in the Balkans to Western democratic values. Our European allies have always been there for us, including in the aftermath of 9/11. Economic values. Our commitments also ushered in the fall of communism and a vibrant European Union that is peaceful and democratic, a club that the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and now Ukraine want into. It's a testament to the success of the painstaking efforts that Republican and Democratic administrations, Republican majority and Democratic majority of a United States Senate adhered to. But these commitments to European security, to NATO, and protecting territorial integrity weren't only good in the past. To say that these alliances and commitments are tired or worn out says that we're tired and we're worn out of peace and tired of maintaining peace for our citizens here in the United States. And that is a fatigue we can never succumb to, ever. Those values are needed today to protect Ukraine and Europe and the United States from a rampant, unlawful, invasive Russia. You know, Mr. President, since the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, along with the rest of Eastern Europe and the Balkan states, has moved rapidly to reorient its politics and policies towards the European Union, toward democracy, toward freedom. It was, in fact, Ukraine's pursuit of a closer relationship with the EU that Putin, the autocrat, used as an excuse to interfere in Ukraine's internal affairs. The invasion of Ukraine also demonstrated the resilience of America's security relationships with Europe and NATO. Never has the European Command of the United States Armed Forces, designed and built to defend Western Europe against a Soviet invasion, has been called upon to coordinate the actual defense of European sovereign borders from the invasion from the East. Today, that's a reality. Europe also very much our partner, saw the threat and rose to the occasion. In part, and I want to acknowledge President Trump's insistence on this, European countries have begun to increase their defense spending, as they should and as they must. They have done so, and they have stepped up by providing material, as we have, advanced missiles, drones, and other military technology for Ukraine. In fact, as a percentage of the gross domestic product, Europe has given more to Ukraine in support and weapons than the United States. We're doing it together. Mr. President, we cannot take for granted that we've had this peace in Europe for 80 years. We cannot take for granted that we did that. It was a result of that sustained commitment of members of this body on both sides of the aisle, of presidents of both parties. Our duty is to keep that alliance united at this stressful time. If Ukraine fails, we should not assume that the European security and our alliances there will survive. World War II ended 80 years ago. We've got to keep it 80 more. The senators that ratified the establishment of NATO and our American European commitments to peace and security on the European continent, they understood that our European alliances are critical to our own security. They would be rightly proud of their success story of 80 years of peace, of democracy, of freedom in Europe. But they'd be horrified at the threat that Putin now poses to Europe, threatening everything that we and those who came before us have worked for. Ukraine's integration with the rest of Europe, their own right to self-determination, Ukraine's battlefield courage, Ukraine's political commitment to democracy and freedom validate the 80 years of America's commitment to creating structures that can enforce and protect peace. Mr. President, turning away from Ukraine now, when it needs us most, could mean the end of that 80-year success story. We must stand by Ukraine and against that unlawful invasion by Mr. Putin. We must stand by our European allies, and we must reaffirm our continued dedication to the work of those who served here before us, to build the alliances, to sustain the alliances that have preserved the peace in Europe. Their future and ours depends on it. Mr. President, I yield back.
The senator from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I begin my formal remarks, let me thank my neighbor from New Hampshire for organizing this bipartisan display of support for Ukraine. Mr. President, on February 24th, 2022, without justification, without provocation, Russia launched a full-scale, brutal invasion of its democratic neighbor, Ukraine, with missiles, air assaults, and army divisions. As John Adams said, facts are stubborn things, and the facts of what happened on that terrible day are undeniable. It was Russia which started the war. Many thought that Ukraine had no chance against the perceived might of the Russian armed forces. However, the Ukrainians fought so bravely against that initial onslaught, and since then, the West has come together with speed and clarity of purpose to support Ukraine. Senator McConnell stated it best last week by saying, Russia's horrible invasion of Ukraine has had a unifying effect on the world's democracies. Mr. President, As a result of the invasion, two nations, Sweden and Finland, joined NATO. Eastern Europe is completing a pivot away from Russia's energy sources, and NATO allies are surging to the 2% GDP goal for defense spending. As for the brave Ukrainians, they pushed back the initial Russian invaders and are now doing their best to hold the line in eastern Ukraine, despite Russian soldiers, ammunitions, and UAVs far outnumbering their Ukrainian counterparts. Ukraine decimated the Russian Black Sea Fleet and has forced Russia to augment its forces with North Korean soldiers and Iranian weapon systems. But despite the successes in the past 3 years, the war drags on with devastating consequences. 390,000 Ukrainians have been wounded, with more than 46,000 deaths so far. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian families have been displaced, and estimates are that approximately 29,000 civilian Ukrainians have lost their lives. In many cases, they were targeted by the Russians. Mr. President, it is not American troops who are dying on the Ukrainian front lines. It is the Ukrainians who are courageously defending their country, their democracy, their way of life. And their defenses directly connect to our efforts in NATO and the defense of Eastern Europe. If Vladimir Putin is allowed to succeed in Ukraine, as several of my colleagues have pointed out, he will not stop there. He will continue to pursue his dream, his goal of recreating the former Soviet Union. He has made that crystal clear. In my judgment, he would most likely seize Moldova next, again invade Georgia, as he did in 2008, threaten the Baltic states, and menace Poland and Finland. The best way to ensure that the United States is not drawn into a larger regional war in Europe, which would directly threaten American troops, is by helping Ukraine defend itself against this unprovoked invasion. The National Security Supplemental Appropriations Package that was signed into law last year included $15.4 billion to help Ukraine purchase American-made weapons. It is strengthening our military readiness, rebuilding our industrial base, and assisting our partners and allies at a volatile and dangerous time in world history. Mr. President, for the past 3 years, we have heard repeatedly the myth that somehow the European countries were not doing their part in helping to equip Ukraine. But let's take a look at the facts. As a percentage of GDP, the United States ranks 17th in support for Ukraine. The top 3 countries include Denmark, Estonia, and Latvia. These NATO nations are all in on supporting Ukraine's defenses because they understand that the stakes are so high. Furthermore, NATO allies have committed more than $185 billion to buy weapons and defense systems produced right here in the United States, which helps us sustain good jobs and strengthens the industrial base. Mr. President, both the Biden administration's slow walking of the delivery of weapons to Ukraine and the Trump administration's pausing military aid and intelligence sharing sent the wrong signal to an aggressive Russia. The decision this afternoon to restart U.S. military aid and intelligence sharing are welcome steps to strengthening Ukraine's position in negotiations. With the tentative ceasefire signed by Ukraine and now up for Russia's concurrence, resumed aid and intelligence sharing with our ally Ukraine allows that country to be in a much stronger position moving forward. Mr. President, history is filled with examples of well-intentioned leaders who sought to avoid war, but who actually made war more likely by refusing to recognize the evil with which they were confronted. Neville Chamberlain declared peace in our time, trying to appease Germany before World War II. We should not make the same mistake today by appeasing Russia. We cannot avert our eyes. We cannot leave an ally to fend for itself, and we must show resolve to deter possible future aggression by China, Iran, and North Korea. Mr. President, our adversaries are watching closely our response in Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President,
The senator from Delaware.
Putin will only stop when we stop him. That piece of wisdom was shared with me on a trip to Europe by a former colleague, Senator McCain. And it seemed to me to predict what has now unfolded over the last 3 years. 3 years ago, I was in Europe with colleagues, visiting American troops training with NATO allies and partners in Poland and Lithuania on the day that the Russians began their illegal, unjustified, full-spectrum invasion of Ukraine. As more than 100,000 combat troops poured over the border, missiles flew in the air, jets bombed. The world recoiled in horror and watched, expecting that the Ukrainians would be overrun in just 3 days. Instead, President Zelensky, the elected president of a democracy, stood firm and stayed fast and defended his country. When offered a last-minute evacuation by America, he said, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." And I am thrilled to be on the floor today with a bipartisan group of my colleagues. Thank you to my colleague from New Hampshire for organizing this, to my colleague from Maine for her words, which I will agree with from beginning to end. We must deter Russia's aggression in Ukraine. If you look at who has joined the fight alongside Russia, Iran, North Korea, this is not a team America should be on. And if we look at who has come to the defense and aid of Ukraine, it is democracies from throughout Europe and the world, more than 50 countries, who in combination have done more than we have, significantly, to welcome Ukrainian refugees, to support the recovery of their economy, and to arm them in this ongoing, desperate, and critical fight for freedom in Ukraine. Who is Vladimir Putin? He is a brutal and aggressive dictator. He is a war criminal. He is someone who has used every ounce of power and resource at his grasp to shatter the peace of Europe that has lasted decades since the Second World War, and to attempt to drive a wedge between the United States and our European partners and allies. The bravery, the determination, the skill, and the capacity of the Ukrainian people to stand and fight is breathtaking. And all of us who've had the honor of visiting Kyiv, of visiting Ukraine, of spending time with those who behind the front line support their troops and those who have served and sacrificed have been forever changed. I had the opportunity with our former colleague and friend, Senator Portman, to go to Kyiv and to present the Liberty Medal from our National Constitution Center to President Zelensky, and to travel through a city shattered by war and to visit with people determined to continue their fight was as inspiring to me as I know it's been to many of my colleagues who've made that same trip. We are here today to ask, who are we and what will we do? We're Americans. We have stood alongside and fought alongside those who have pursued democracy, those who've stood up for liberty for decades around the world, and we should not shrink from this fight. We can and should insist on a just and lasting peace. We would all like to see this brutal war come to an end. We would all like to see the suffering stop. But to force on Ukraine a ceasefire that is really a surrender, masked as a ceasefire, would be to betray the sacrifice and the service of so many. Asking Ukraine to willingly give up conquered territory and recognize Russian sovereignty. Asking Ukraine to give up its desire for security and for integration into the West. To ask Ukraine to agree to limits on its military and its capacity to be prepared for what is a likely renewed Russian assault in the future, all of these would lead to not a neutral Ukraine, but a neutered Ukraine. We know what happens next. What happens next is that the world will look at whatever peace we can secure for Ukraine and ask, are we reliable? Is the United States a reliable ally and partner? Putin has already suffered a strategic defeat. NATO has already been expanded. The border between NATO and Russia has doubled. Our partners throughout the world have come to this fight, and they are committing even more in recent weeks as Europe has stepped up to pledge hundreds of billions of dollars more. If we are to restore deterrence, if we are to sustain the peace, if we are to be the indispensable nation that we have worked and fought so long to be, we must finish the job. We must deter Putin from future aggression by demanding that Ukraine be secured by a just and lasting peace. The news today that intelligence and security cooperation has restarted is encouraging. But we have a resolution co-sponsored by all the members on the floor today that makes clear where we stand. We stand with Ukraine. We stand with democracy. We insist on a just and lasting peace in this instance. And we stand for Ukraine. Slava Ukraine.